Morning Marcus Holt got fired, he was holding a mop. Not because he had done anything wrong. Not because he had stolen anything, broken anything, or disrespected anyone. He was holding a mop because that was his job. Or at least the job they knew about. The Vantage Industries head office in Calgary occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on 8th Avenue. It was the kind of building that made people feel small on purpose. The lobby had marble floors and a security desk staffed by men in pressed shirts, and the elevators moved so quietly you could hear yourself think. Marcus had been cleaning those floors for 7 months. He knew which tiles near the east stairwell had started to lift at the corner. He knew that the coffee machine on the 14th floor leaked slightly behind the drip tray and that nobody had reported it. He noticed things. That had always been his problem and his gift, depending on who you asked. He was 43 years old. His son Owen was 9. Owen had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition 18 months earlier, and the medication alone ran close to $4,000 a month after partial coverage. Marcus had sold his design consultancy 18 months ago. Not because it had failed, but because the legal fees from his divorce had gutted him, and the consultancy needed investment he no longer had. He had taken the cleaning contract through a staffing agency because it came with benefits, and the benefits covered Owen's prescriptions, and that was the only math that mattered. Nobody at Vantage knew any of that. To them, he was the quiet man who showed up before 7 and left before the offices filled. He kept his head down. He did his work. He was invisible in the way that people are invisible when other people decide not to look. The design mock-up was spread across the glass table in the Meridian boardroom on the 16th floor. Marcus had been wiping down the windows in the hallway outside when he noticed it. The campaign was for a national infrastructure account, the kind of pitch that determined whether an agency kept its biggest client or lost everything. He had paused. He couldn't help it. He had spent 11 years doing exactly this kind of work, and what he saw on that table was wrong in a very specific, very fixable way. The color hierarchy was off. The visual weight of the secondary elements was competing with the headline instead of supporting it. Whoever had built it hadn't considered how it would render on dark backgrounds, which the client used in all their public signage. He had set down his spray bottle and walked in. He had moved 3 elements. He had adjusted the contrast ratio on the header. It had taken 4 minutes. He was walking back toward the hallway when Sandra Voss came through the door. Sandra Voss was the chief creative officer of Vantage Industries. She was 51, precise, and had built her reputation on an intolerance for ambiguity. She ran her department like a surgical unit. Everything sterile, everything deliberate, no room for improvisation. She had not become the youngest CCO in the company's history by being soft, and she had not kept the position for 6 years by being careless. She was also, in ways she would not have admitted to anyone, deeply afraid. The Meridian account was worth $11 million annually. It was her account. She had staked her credibility on winning the renewal, and she had just found a maintenance worker standing over her team's presentation materials. "What are you doing in here?" Marcus turned around. He was still holding the cleaning cloth. "I noticed something in the layout," he said, which was, in retrospect, exactly the wrong thing to say. Sandra looked at the table. She looked at him. "You touched the design." There was a problem with the visual hierarchy, the contrast on the N. "Stop." Her voice was flat and very controlled. "You are not authorized to be in this room. You are not authorized to touch anything on this table. And you have just tampered with a client presentation that goes to review in 2 hours. "I didn't tamper with it. I corrected it." The word hung in the air between them. Sandra Voss was not a person who got loudly angry. That, in some ways, made it worse. She picked up the phone on the credenza and called building security. She called human resources. She stood with her arms folded and her jaw tight, and she said nothing more to Marcus, as though he had already ceased to exist. 2 security guards arrived in 4 minutes. A woman from HR named Patricia stood in the doorway with her tablet and a practiced expression of neutral regret. "Your access card will be deactivated as of right now," Patricia said. "Please collect your personal belongings from the maintenance locker and leave the premises." Marcus looked at Sandra one more time. He was not angry, or rather, he was angry in the way that people are angry when they know that anger won't help. "The client uses dark backgrounds on all their exterior signage," he said. "The way the header was built, it'll wash out completely in field conditions. I moved it 2 centimeters and adjusted the opacity. That's all." Sandra did not respond. She had already turned back to the table. Marcus collected his jacket and his thermos. He took the elevator down. The marble lobby was quiet in the way it always was at that hour, and the security guard at the desk watched him go with the careful non-expression of a man who had seen this before. Marcus pushed through the glass doors into the November air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the building. He thought about Owen's prescription. He thought about the fact that the next payment to the staffing agency was due in 9 days, and that without this contract he had no benefits, and without benefits he had no coverage, and without coverage he had no idea how he was going to afford the medication. He started walking toward the LRT station. He did not let himself stop thinking clearly, because if he stopped thinking clearly, the other thing would come in, and he couldn't afford that right now. What Marcus did not know, what he had no way of knowing as he walked down 8th Avenue with his thermos under his arm, was that Sandra Boss had turned back to the table, looked at the design, and gone completely still. She had been staring at it for 3 minutes when her senior art director, Kevin Aldrich, walked in. Kevin Aldrich was 38, charming in the particular way of someone who had learned that charm was a professional tool, and he had been with Vantage for 4 years. He was also, though Sandra did not yet know it, the reason the design had been wrong in the first place. "The Meridian deck is ready," Kevin said, dropping into a chair. "I made the final changes this morning." Sandra was still looking at the table. "Did you?" "Yeah. I think it's strong." She picked up one of the boards. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, systematically, without sentiment. "When did you adjust the header opacity?" Kevin looked up. Something crossed his face very quickly. "This morning, like I said." "And the visual weight distribution on the secondary panel?" "I've been working on this for 3 weeks, Sandra. I know every element on this board." Sandra set the board down. She said nothing. She picked up her phone and called her assistant and asked for the version history on the Meridian files from the shared drive. The version history came back in 12 minutes. The last edit logged to Kevin Aldrich's credentials was at 11:47 p.m. the night before. The contrast ratio on the header and the position of the secondary panel had not been adjusted at that time. In fact, according to the log, the file had not been opened again after that point, except that the physical boards on the table were different from the last saved version. Sandra sat down. She looked at the physical boards. She looked at the digital version on her laptop. She looked at the physical boards again. Then she called the staffing agency. The woman at the agency was apologetic and efficient. She explained that Marcus Holt's contract had indeed just been terminated by Vantage. She also, because Sandra asked the right questions in the right order, mentioned that Mr. Arust, Holt had previously run his own design consultancy, Holt Creative, for approximately 11 years before closing it in 2022. He had worked with infrastructure clients. He had won 2 national design awards. He had, the agency woman added, listed his previous clients on his general resume, though that resume had not been forwarded to Vantage because it wasn't relevant to a cleaning contract. Sandra closed her laptop. She sat in the Meridian boardroom for a long time, and what she felt was not quite guilt and not quite embarrassment, but something that lived in the territory between the two. The particular feeling of someone who has just discovered that their certainty was built on a foundation they never bothered to check. She had fired a man with 11 years of design expertise for correcting a mistake that her senior art director had made and then tried to claim credit for. She picked up her phone and called Patricia in HR. "I need Marcus Holt's contact information," she said. There was a pause. "He was just terminated this morning, Sandra." "I'm aware of that." Another pause. "I'll send it over." Marcus was at a Tim Hortons 2 blocks from the LRT when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered it, because when you are having the kind of day he was having, not answering seems like one risk too many. "Marcus Holt?" The voice was Sandra Voss. He recognized it immediately. "Yes. This is Sandra Voss. I'm calling to ask if you'd be willing to come back to the office." The Tim Hortons was warm and smelled like coffee and fresh donuts. A man in a Flames jersey was reading a newspaper at the counter. A mother was trying to get a toddler back into a coat. Everything was very ordinary, and Marcus was standing in the middle of it, holding his phone with an expression that the woman behind the counter would later describe to her husband as the look of a man who can't decide whether to laugh or cry. "I've just been terminated," he said. "I know. My access card has been deactivated." "I know that too." "So what exactly?" Marcus said carefully. Are you asking me to come back for? Sandra was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that people who knew her well would have found almost unrecognizable. The precision was still there, but the armor had shifted slightly. I looked at what you changed, she said, and then I looked at our version history, and then I called the staffing agency. Marcus waited. Your background in infrastructure design, the work you did with Halloran Transit and with the provincial signage program in 2019, that's exactly the kind of experience this project needed. I didn't know you had it. I should have asked more questions before I reacted. You had me escorted out of the building. Yes, she said, I did. It was the absence of justification that surprised him. He had been expecting an explanation, a context, a reframing. Instead, she had simply agreed with what he'd said, and there was something in that acknowledgement that was harder to dismiss than any argument would have been. I also, Sandra continued, have a problem with one of my team members that I think you may have inadvertently helped me identify. Marcus sat down. Tell me. She told him about the version history. She told him about Kevin Aldrich's claim that he had made the final changes, and about the timestamps that made that impossible. She told him that there was a client presentation in, she checked, 94 minutes, and that the Meridian account was the most significant active contract in the agency's portfolio. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Sandra said. I'm asking if you're willing to help me fix this. You'd be compensated at a consulting rate, not a maintenance rate. And I'd like to talk to you afterward about a different kind of arrangement, if you're open to it. Marcus looked out the window of the Tim Hortons at the November street. A bus went by. Pigeons scattered. He thought about what his answer would have been if Owen didn't exist. He thought it would probably have been different. I want the compensation in writing before I walk back in, he said. I'll have it drafted in the next 20 minutes. And I want to know what you're going to do about Aldrich. There was a pause. That's being handled. That's not an answer. Another pause. Longer this time. Kevin Aldrich will not be presenting the Meridian account today, Sandra said. What happens after that depends on what our investigation finds. But he will not be presenting today. Marcus looked at his thermos sitting on the table. It was a battered thing, dented on the side from the time he dropped it in the parking lot at Owen's school. Owen had drawn a small dinosaur on the dent with a Sharpie marker because Owen was the kind of kid who thought that putting a dinosaur on a dent made it better. And somehow he wasn't wrong. I'll come in, Marcus said. He came in through the front doors of 8th Avenue Tower 40 minutes later. The same security guard was at the desk. The man looked up, and there was a brief moment of visible recalibration. The guard had watched him leave, and now here he was, coming back, with a visitor's badge being handed to him by Patricia from HR, who had met him in the lobby with an expression that suggested she was revising several of her earlier assessments. Sandra met him on the 16th floor. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning, but something in her posture was different. A degree of rigidity had gone out of it, as though the armor was still on but no longer quite so tightly fastened. She led him into the Meridian boardroom and closed the door. The boards were still on the table. Marcus looked at them the way he always looked at design problems. Not as a critic, but as someone trying to understand what the work was trying to say and whether it was saying it clearly. The changes I made this morning were structural, he said. But there's more. He walked to the table. The color palette works for print, but your client's exterior applications are almost entirely backlit digital signage. The saturation is going to blow out. You need a secondary specification for digital environments, and it needs to be built into the system document, not treated as a separate afterthought. Sandra pulled a chair up to the table. Show me. For the next 70 minutes, they worked. Not in the way that a consultant works with a client, with a careful social geometry of deference and authority, but in the way that two people work when the problem in front of them is more important than the hierarchy between them. Marcus talked through the infrastructure signage standards he had navigated on the provincial program. Sandra pushed back twice, and both times he adjusted his recommendation, because she knew things about the client's internal politics that changed the practical constraints. They built something better than either of them would have built alone. At one point, Sandra's assistant knocked and opened the door to say that Kevin Aldrich was asking to speak with her. Tell him I'll call him this afternoon, Sandra said without looking up from the table. The assistant closed the door. Marcus didn't ask about it. He kept working. The Meridian clients arrived at 2 o'clock. There were 4 of them, a director of communications, a procurement officer, and two people Marcus recognized from the provincial signage program as being the kind of stakeholders who had seen enough pitches to be impossible to impress with anything that wasn't genuinely good. Cassandra presented. She had incorporated the digital signage specifications into the deck with a fluency that suggested she had known them for weeks rather than 70 minutes. Partway through, she stopped and said, "I want to bring in someone who has direct experience with your kind of signage environment." She nodded toward the back of the room where Marcus was sitting. He stood up. He talked for 8 minutes. The director of communications leaned forward about 3 minutes in, and stayed leaning forward for the rest of it. When the clients left, the procurement officer shook Marcus's hand at the elevator and said, "That's the first time I've sat in an agency pitch and felt like they actually understood the field conditions." The elevator doors closed. Cassandra stood beside Marcus in the corridor afterward. The floor was quiet. Most of the team had cleared out. "Kevin Aldrich submitted his resignation this afternoon," she said, "before I had the chance to act on the investigation findings, which tells you something about what the investigation would have found." Marcus had suspected as much. The version history had told a clear story. Kevin had been delivering other people's ideas for long enough that he had gotten careless about the evidence. "There's a senior design director position that's been open for 2 months," Sandra said. "I've been holding it because I hadn't found the right person. The salary is $112,000, plus benefits, plus a project bonus structure." She paused. "Full benefits, medical included." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about Owen. He thought about the Sharpie dinosaur on the thermostat. He thought about the morning he had walked out of these doors with his jacket and his thermos, and a feeling that he recognized now as the particular heaviness of a person who has been reduced to less than they are. "I have one condition," he said. Cassandra looked at him. "The staffing agency I was contracted through. They place a lot of people in building maintenance and support roles. A lot of them are in situations similar to mine. I want the company to review its benefit structure for contracted workers, not just direct hires." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's going to take time, and it's going to cost money." "I know." She looked at him. "I'll bring it to the board. That's all I'm asking." She extended her hand. He shook it. Marcus Holt started as senior design director on a Monday in December. His first week, he redesigned the company's contractor onboarding documentation because it was badly organized and nobody had fixed it because nobody with the authority to fix it had ever had a reason to read it carefully. He did it on his own time because it needed doing. Owen asked him on the Friday of that first week whether his new job was good. Marcus thought about it the way he always thought about Owen's questions, seriously, because Owen deserved serious answers. "Yeah," he said, "it's good. It's what I'm supposed to be doing." Owen considered this. Are the people nice? Marcus thought about Sandra Voss, who was not exactly nice, but who was honest, and who was learning, visibly, imperfectly, to see things she had trained herself not to look at. "Some of them are getting there," he said. Owen seemed satisfied with that. He went back to his drawing. He was working on something with a lot of dinosaurs and what appeared to be a space station, which was, in Marcus's considered opinion, a perfectly reasonable combination. Marcus watched him for a moment, then opened his laptop and got back to work. "I keep thinking about the moment Marcus walked back through those glass doors. Not because it was triumphant. It wasn't. Not really. It was quiet. A man with a battered thermos and a visitor's badge, returning to a place that had just told him he didn't belong there. What strikes me most isn't the injustice of the firing. Unfair things happen every day. What strikes me is what Marcus did in the hour between walking out and walking back in. He didn't collapse. He didn't rage. He sat in a Tim Hortons, thought clearly, and when the phone rang, he answered it, and he negotiated. He set conditions. He asked for things in writing. That's not luck. That's what it looks like when someone has spent years building the kind of inner steadiness that doesn't crack under pressure, even when everything is on the line. There's something in that worth sitting with. Marcus could have said no. Honestly, most people would have said no and nobody could have blamed them. But he understood something that's easy to miss when you're angry, that walking away clean isn't always the same as walking away right. He went back not because he needed to prove something to Sandra Voss, but because there was a real problem in front of him that he knew how to solve, and because his son's medication didn't care about his dignity. He held both of those truths at once, without letting either one destroy the other. That takes a kind of moral clarity that I find genuinely rare. And then there's Sandra. I don't think she's a villain in this story, even though she acted like one for about 45 minutes. What she did: calling a staffing agency, looking at the version history, picking up the phone and saying, "I was wrong," without dressing it up in excuses. That took something too. It would have been so easy to let the decision stand. Nobody at that company was going to challenge her on it. She chose not to, and that choice is the hinge the whole story turns on. Integrity isn't just about the big moments. Sometimes it's about a phone call you didn't have to make. Kevin Aldrich is the cautionary note underneath all of it. He had the title, the chair at the table, the 4 years of relationship equity, and he spent it on borrowed credit until the timestamps caught up with him. I think about that a lot. The way small dishonesties compound quietly until the structure can't hold. You can get away with it for a long time. And then one day the version history is right there on the screen, and there's nowhere left to stand. What Owen draws on thermoses with a Sharpie. Dinosaurs on dents, space stations next to craters, that's its own kind of philosophy. He takes what's broken and puts something on it. Not to pretend the damage isn't there, but to make it mean something different. I think Marcus learned that from him, or maybe they learned it from each other. Either way, I think that's the thing worth carrying. The dent is still there. You just decide what goes on top of it.